in a lot of relationships where childcare is not shared at all, mothers end up feeling like they're carrying the whole burden themselves, and fathers can feel distant, left on the periphery of their families, and the burden of looking after children falls entirely on mothers. If you look at the gender pay gap in the UK, and at the age people have kids, it suddenly starts to significantly widen. And that's because you get this combination of things like bad paternity leave, incredibly expensive childcare, which is well over the average salary. We haven't yet done the work of reshaping what the new role for men is. Like, we've expanded the role of women and given women more options, but we've not done that for men. And so there is a vacuum there.
The vacuum that's potentially left behind by the women at home, for example.
90%, 90, agree that these days fathers want to be a bigger part of their kids' life. Dads who are more involved in looking after their kids are much less likely to separate and for their marriages to break down.
I read a lot of research about dad's influence on kids as they're growing up on a bunch of aspects in terms of their security, and they seek approval from the outside world or not. So their moms have a huge influence, but I think dad's influence has been not fully appreciated.
There is really clear evidence that improving paternity leave reduces that gender pay gap, reduces the motherhood penalty, makes it so that childcare is more evenly shared between couples where they want to. And good paternity leave is good for mums, it's good for dads, and it's good for kids as well.
Hey Alex, welcome to Dadsense.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to meet you, and I'm looking forward to our chat. Of course, I've been reading about you and the DadShift movement in the UK, and it's pretty quite inspired by everything that you and your work have been trying to do. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
Oh, thank you. Me too.
We'll start by I heard a little bit about you and, of course, your work over the last several months. But one of the things that I picked up from a podcast that you had with a podcast called Startup Dad was what inspired you to get into this space. And in fact, there's a commonality between why I got into this podcast, but I would love for our audience to hear what was the inspiration behind first wanting to get involved as a dad, thinking about your childhood with your dad and you becoming a father, and then later on to start this movement called DadShift. Let's start there.
Sure. So my interest in this area came initially out of my dad's experience and my experience of him. So back in the day, there was no paternity leave at all in the UK, of course. So my elder brother was born 9 o'clock on a Sunday night. My dad was back at work 12 hours later, 9 a.m. the next day. And he worked long hours, so he didn't really see us 5 days a week. He was out of work really before we were up, and then on the train home whilst we were in bed. And that meant he didn't really play much in a role in looking after us, and we didn't bond with him as strongly as we did with my mum. And that persisted really until we were adults. And the distance between him and the rest of the family unit contributed to the breakdown of his marriage. And he's now...
So your dad and mom sort of separated at some point?
They separated, yeah, when I was a teenager. And the fact that he was not really involved in looking after us and was sort of became separate to the unit was my mum and the three of us.
Yep.
And him separate to that was part of the distance that built up between then and contributed to the breakdown of that relationship. And that is something you see across the board. Actually, there's really clear evidence that dads who are more involved in looking after their kids are much less likely to separate and for their marriages to break down.
It's fascinating. I had not thought of, just a quick interjection, I had not thought of that correlation on marriages breaking down and how involved fatherhood can actually help not let that happen. So it's fascinating because in the Indian culture, it's not that obvious. So it's fascinating to hear that. And I'm sorry that happened, but I appreciate you sharing that difficult moment I'm sure it must have been a difficult moment for you as well as growing up as a child.
It was. Yeah. I think it was one of those where everyone's happier for it having happened.
Yep.
It's no divorce is easy, but it was a good one, if that makes sense. And yeah, it's the impact on relationships is really significant. I mean, my favorite example of this in action is a study from Iceland. So Iceland brought in really good paternity leave in the year 2000, And if someone 15 years later compared divorce rates amongst couples who got married in 1999, so the year before it came in, versus those who got married in 2001, so the year after it came in, and even 15 years later, you're significantly less likely to have been divorced if you got married in 2001 versus 1999. And that's because you end up with, in a lot of relationships where childcare is not shared at all, mothers end up feeling like they're carrying the whole burden themselves, and fathers can feel either distant and also feel actually resentful that they're not getting that opportunity to be with their kids, and that the work burden falls squarely on them, so it can build up this distance. But going back to my own dad, I'm now a dad to a 3-year-old boy. In some ways, to my surprise, my dad is a very kind of devoted and soppy grandparent, and it's given us a sort of lens to start talking about his experience. And he feels like he really missed out on having that with us when we were kids. But he says, I just didn't know anything different. I didn't know
anything better.
Different. Anything better. And the reality is that even though attitudes have changed in the UK, a lot of the systems and the policies that are in place have not changed that much. And so it's still far too common that fathers are left on the periphery of their families, and the burden of looking after children falls entirely on mothers. And, in my own life, I've been determined to do that differently, but then seen a lot of those barriers in action. And that's what led to my interest in this area, alongside the more I looked into it, seeing that actually there were mums groups campaigning around this in the UK, and the dads weren't really showing up in big numbers. And that didn't feel right to me. Why should mums be doing this for us? Like, we want this, it will benefit us. Like, we need to step up. So that was another part of why we wanted to go ahead with this.
That's incredible. Which year was this, and were you at what stage of fatherhood where you felt the struggle and you thought that this was too personal and you wanted to kind of do something to make it better, or it was maybe a year or two later?
Yeah, it was more recent than that. So we launched in September 2024. So just over 6 months going. And I was relatively lucky that I actually had quite good paternity leave. And it's interesting, is a couple of us working on the campaign who had good paternity leave. I got 6 weeks at full pay. I was running my own company, so I got to set the policy myself. Nice. So that was great. I would have liked more, but 6 weeks is
6 weeks is good.
Way better than what people get. Yeah,
which is how much?
It's 2 weeks paid at less than half the minimum wage, so it's £184 a week, which is not enough to live off. It's below the poverty line. And so what you see is that a lot of people just can't take any time at all. About a third of people take no time whatsoever. They're back to work the day after their child is born. And of those who do take that time off, around 50% end up in financial hardship. And we hear stories from people who have been struggling with that for years after paternity leave. I mean, one guy I spoke to recently who is self-employed. He's a self-employed tradesman. And if you're self-employed, you get absolutely nothing. You don't even get those 2 weeks and that level of pay. You get nothing. And his wife had 2 emergency cesarean sections when their babies were born, because they were both premature. And he took 6 weeks off unpaid to look after them. And he says 6 years later, he's still not recovered financially from that. And this financial stress that it heaped onto the 2 of them destroyed his mental health, destroyed his wife's mental health, and drove him to the point where he attempted suicide. And that is what this, the extreme end, what this does to people, because most people can't afford to lose £1,000 of pay to take 2 weeks off to look after their kids, but they want to do the right thing, and they want to bond with their children. They want to support their partner. And so many people just face this impossible choice.
Yeah, it's incredible. I was just thinking as you're narrating, there's so many layers to the implications, right? It starts with the financial aspect, but then later on goes to mental health, breakdown of relationships. Yeah. So even though the generations have changed, right? Like, more dads are more willing to get engaged because they know there's another option, but the system hasn't really caught up to it.
That's it. Yeah. And another big area this touches on is gender equality. So there's this idea that's talked about more and more in the UK, which is the motherhood penalty.
Yeah.
which is essentially the sort of set of economic disadvantages that women take on after they have children. So if you look at the gender pay gap in the UK and in a lot of Western European countries, it's now very small before people have children.
Hmm.
It's only a few percentage points. But at the age people have kids, it suddenly starts to significantly widen. And that's because you get this combination of things like bad paternity leave, incredibly expensive childcare. To have 2 kids in childcare in the UK can cost £3,000 a month, which is well over the average salary.
Yeah, which is basically equivalent to another person's job, right? In terms of salary.
Yeah, more than. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
more than
over
that.
what you would
Yeah,
earn if you're on an average salary. It's extraordinary. It's one of the most expensive in the world. And on top of that, for a lot of people, flexible working options are not really there, which makes it really hard to juggle work around having a child, which means mothers end up by default, because they're the ones who've had time off to look after the child, whether or not this is what they want as a couple, they become the sole primary caregiver.
yep,
They're the ones who step back from work. A lot of mothers face discrimination at work because they're seen as a baby risk by their employers. And so 74,000 people who lose their jobs whilst they're pregnant or on maternity leave each year. And that all adds up to this motherhood penalty. And there is really clear evidence that improving paternity leave reduces that gender pay gap, reduces the motherhood penalty, makes it so that childcare is more evenly shared between couples where they want to, and starts to take a big step towards gender equality. So that is another major part of this. It's basically good paternity leave. It's good for mums, it's good for dads, and it's good for kids as well,
yep.
because they do better at school and they grow up to be happier, more well-rounded individuals if they have a close relationship with both parents rather than just one.
That's right. Yeah, I've definitely read a lot of research about dad's influence on kids as they're growing up on a bunch of aspects in terms of their security and sort of how they, whether they seek approval from the outside world or not. So their moms have a huge influence, but I think dad's influence has been not fully appreciated over the
Yeah.
several years, which now it's only beginning to come out from research.
Yes, that very clear research, and
Yeah,
even the UK government itself did a report a few years ago that explicitly said it is good for children when they have a close relationship with their fathers. Like, that's pretty well established now, but we've not yet, at least here, taken significant policy steps to make that more likely to happen for most families.
yeah, yeah. I was telling you about my origin of why I
Yeah.
got into this space, and there was an uncanny similarity between your and my story, because my dad, he wasn't working for another company, but he had his own business, but he was gone pretty much the whole week, and I got really strong bonding along with my sisters with my mom, but I really craved for my dad's connections. Again, it wasn't like he didn't want to give, but he didn't know better. And then eventually I just only look back at an opportunity lost, right? And that's when I
Mm-hmm.
became a dad, which is about, my son's 13 and my daughter is 10 now. This is one of the things that I wanted to intentionally focus as a father myself. But then, and we became parents when I was living in the US, moved back to India. And when I moved back to India, culturally, I saw something similar to the previous generation, because the Indian cultural system is, we got a lot of help. There are different generations, of grandparents, parents, children living in the same household. So in a lot of ways, dads, don't need to get involved if they don't want to. Unlike in the UK or in the Western world, where it's literally nuclear families. When if the mom
Mm.
and dad are, if the dad's gone, the mom has to do all the heavy lifting. In India, it's slightly different. So that is what kind of motivated me to start having conversations with other fathers, and that was the origin of Dadsense as a podcast.
Yeah, that's super interesting. As you say, very similar, and I think reflects a lot of people's experiences. We did some polling actually with fathers in the UK, and 90%, 90, agreed that these days fathers want to be a bigger part of their kids' lives. Like,
Yeah,
we are part of a generation that feels differently,
that's right.
but are still pushing up against barriers that make it hard for us to live out those values in how we actually parent.
Yeah.
How does your dad feel about that now? His experience when you were younger.
Well, unfortunately, I lost my dad 7 years back. So my kids were a
Sorry for
little,
that.
thank you. My kids were younger, and I don't know that he could. And he was struggling with Parkinson's, so his facilities were sort of deteriorating. So I really didn't get a chance to, engage in a dialogue about how he felt and what he would have done. So it's like I said, it's only something that I rue of what could have been,
Mm.
instead of what was the reality.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one something I've found speaking to men of that generation and older, and again we see this in some of the poly evidence, is that sort of seems the older men get, the more kind of clarity they get on what really matters in their life, and the more they think, do you know what, it was my kids, and I wish I had more time with my kids. I wish I'd been more involved.
Yeah,
That sort of seems to be the regret that grows. Um, but yeah, I hope we can be part of a generation that changes it, at least for, at least by the time my son is looking at having
yeah,
having kids.
yeah,
That would be good.
yeah. And to your point, actually, towards the end, the last few years with my dad, and that's one of the reasons why we moved back to India, to be closer to him. I would go spend time with him, and I would just sit with him. Even sometimes I would just feed him because he was not able to eat properly.
Mm.
And those were beautiful moments, and I would just sort of cherish and really savor every moment, because I could feel that we could have definitely had a stronger connection. Um, so absolutely,
And it's that kind of connection that you can build in a unique way through caregiving, right? Like
yeah.
there is something about looking after someone and providing for their needs and providing emotional support that gives you a closeness that is hard to get through other ways, right? And that
So
applies
true,
to looking after children. Yeah.
so true, so true. Yeah, I never thought about it actually. Yeah, through those last few years of these difficult times, I really strong developed a strong connection with him, and and you're right, it was probably through that experience of caregiving, because he could feel my care, and I was sort of thanking my fortune that I could at least do that. That's a very good point you made. I never thought about it.
Mm.
Let's shift to, I know, from fatherhood, you also broadened your conversation to masculinity, right? And you
Yeah.
talk about a crisis in masculinity and the vacuum that's left by traditional male roles. What did you really mean by that crisis in masculinity and in this sort of
Mm.
times of transition?
So in the UK and other Western European countries, definitely the US, and I think to varying degrees all around the world, over the last 40 or 50 years, the role, what was traditionally the male role in the family and society, has started to blur a bit. So it used to be that men were responsible for providing for the family. They went out, had a job, had a career. Women exclusively stayed at home and looked after children. And as women started to move out of that space and started to move into the workforce and have careers and have independence and earn their own livings, which is a really good thing. It's provided women with much more freedom than they had in previous generations. We haven't yet done the work of reshaping what the new role for men is. Right, we've
That's right.
expanded the role of women and given women more options, but we've not done that for men. And so there is a vacuum there where we can't say this is, I know very clearly this is what I'm here to do, right? It's my career, my job to provide, but we haven't really filled it with the addition to that.
The
And so
vacuum
what you're
that's
seeing,
potentially left behind by the women at home, for example, right?
yes, exactly, like we
Yeah,
haven't expanded the male role to include the domestic sphere,
that's right.
right? We haven't said you can both have a career and also you're needed at home, and that's where you can get fulfillment and status as well, is from active parenthood, for example. And so that vacuum is being filled by increasingly by ideas coming from people who push a very um, kind of strident form of old school masculinity as the answer. It's like we're going to get our status back as men by reasserting our dominance, by in opposition to women rather than in common cause with them.
Right.
And you see that from the rise of Trump in the US.
Yep.
You see it in some of the European elections with the rise of far right parties, where there's very clear evidence that misogyny is a big driver of some of that extremism. And we're seeing it to an extent in the UK as well. And it's something that we're all quite concerned about. And we think that we need to do a better job, big we in that sense, societally, of saying actually, particularly to young men, because the most worrying thing is that this rise is steepest and most noticeable now amongst men under 25.
Right.
You see that in elections around the world.
Yeah, we saw that in the US.
Far right.
A lot more younger men voted for Trump.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And the German elections that were a couple of weeks ago, you were more likely to vote for the AfD, which is a very far right party, if you were a man under 25 than the general population. They were some of the biggest supporters of the very far right party. Women, on the other hand, are moving quite radically to the left. And so you've got this big gender split in a generation coming through, like polarization around gender, which is relatively new. And that is not a good thing to be passing through our political systems for the next 40, 50 years, because the recipe that creates for conflict and the pushback on feminism and rights for women is quite concerning. So yeah, that's what we're talking about, the crisis of masculinity. We think fatherhood has a role to play in saying, look, this is a different idea of how you can be a man today that is more positive, that is in common cause with women and not in opposition to them.
Yeah, so how does fatherhood present that opportunity for a healthier identity for men?
So I think really what everyone is looking for in life, right, is to be needed, to have recognition, to feel connection.
Yep.
And part of the challenge of a lot of men face is that traditional ideas of masculinity, at least in the West, are to push people away from having that connection, right? It's to hold your emotions in.
That's right.
You can't show
Do not
weakness,
express.
can't show vulnerability.
Yep.
Don't express. Yeah. And we are starting to see a shift away from that culturally, which is really positive. But it's still quite entrenched. And for me, I wanted to be an active father because I thought that is where in my life I'm going to have the most meaningful connection and status with my son. And my career and everything I do outside that, also valuable, but really, like, this is to me what it is about. But the problem is, if you say to men, you're kind of optional in that sphere, right? Like, after your baby's born, you're only going to be around for a few days. It's kind of all on the mum. If you're in the US, you may have 0 paid leave.
That's right.
You have no time off. Same for mothers, actually, which is wild.
Yeah,
but
it's crazy. I lived there.
That's a whole.
And we became parents in the US, so I have lived
Right.
that life myself. Of course, California was a little bit liberal, but yeah, absolutely, it's probably the worst that can be anywhere in the world.
It's extremely strange, but
Yeah.
that's a
different
conversation.
Yeah.
But yeah, if the message you're told is like you're kind of peripheral, and women can do the be the family and they can go out and have a career, then it's harder. There's barriers to people getting that connection, being integral, feeling needed within the family unit, being part of it. That takes away some of that opportunity for status fulfillment that can come from fatherhood.
Right. That makes sense. And then, so as like you said, it sort of unites men and women towards a common cause, right? As opposed to being on the opposite side of each other.
Yes, exactly.
So I think that
Yeah.
there's that sort of aspect to it. I'm curious, how are you spreading this message? It's one thing to understand these correlations and these impacts. There's another thing to go out there and, which is what I was quite impressed by. And I know, I spotted you because Brene Brown, I think, posted your message on LinkedIn, and I'm sure your calendar and your messages have gone crazy since then. Me being one of them. But I'm just wondering, how are you spreading this message, and how are you growing this movement?
So we're trying to grow it through a combination of speaking to the public and working with MPs in the UK Parliament who back this issue. So starting with the kind of public facing, what our goal there is to move this up the agenda politically and in the press and amongst the public, for people to develop an understanding of what is going on, why it's a problem. So like a lot of people don't know how bad the paternity leave here is until they become parents, and
Sure.
then they're pretty shocked. And what's interesting is that we launched the campaign with a stunt that we went around London and put baby slings on
I
statues
saw that
with
photo.
dolls in them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was
and
cool.
people really got into it. They found the kind of implicit stories quite funny. It was Thierry Henry that
Was it
put
legal, by
the
the way?
slide.
Or you got
I
into
think
trouble?
it's basically no. We didn't get into trouble. We didn't do any damage. Like
No,
we
just
put these slings on and then took them off
took them
straight
off.
away.
Yeah,
And we had some security guards around, and no one really cared.
right.
We're quite sort of liberal about that stuff over here. And that got a lot of attention for the message, but I think it got that attention because there is this generation of parents now who just totally get it. Like they want things to be one way, and they've come through and they've realized that it's not as equal as they want it to be. It's still, the burden still falls too much on the mother.
Yeah.
And so for them, what we're trying to do is bring those people together and give them a language to talk about it, to understand what's the implications of this thing they kind of intuitively know, and just be making a ton of noise around it on social media and pressuring decision makers. And then on the parliamentary side, we've got around 30 or 40 Labour Party MPs who are
It's a
supporting
huge
the
win.
campaign. Yeah, again, a lot of them, because they are parents themselves, newly elected, they just completely get this. They see why it's such a big problem, and they see how bizarre it is for a country like the UK that sees itself as quite progressive on stuff like gender
That's right.
to be at the bottom of the table when it comes to paternity leave. So they are being brilliant at kind of inside pressure, raising it with ministers, raising it in parliament to help lift the issue up through up the list in terms of priorities within the government and amongst MPs.
Yeah, yeah. Now going back to your previous point on younger men getting more disillusioned about potentially this rise of feminism and getting trying to get bolstered by some of the far right messages. How how do we shift that narrative in younger men? And I'm pretty sure, to your point, I've seen that whatever happens in the West, the East catches up to it, for
Mm-hmm.
good or bad, for most
Mm-hmm.
part. So it's like for good stuff, like progressive movements also come to the East, particularly India, and some of the far right stuff as well. So the world is so interconnected, right? So even if the younger men are not as outraged by the sort of so-called feminism in the West, as in the West, I'm sure if it's here in some shape or form. If it's not here, it will be here. So how do we shift
Yeah.
the narrative for the younger men?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think it's not one that is answered simply. And what I've seen is that a lot of people in the UK, Europe, and the US are suddenly waking up to this problem and kind of scrambling to work out how do we fix this, because everyone is alarmed at the idea of a generation of men coming through who've been sold some pretty dark messages about what it means to be a man,
Yep.
who, we want to tackle that before it's too entrenched. So I think there's a couple of things I'll point to. One is coming back to that idea of showing how patriarchy, for want of a better word, is
Hmm.
bad for men as well as for women. So I think that looks like talking about things like, this is part of what makes you more depressed, right? You're being the fact that men are told you can't talk about your feelings, you can't communicate. Men struggle with their mental health massively. I think
That's
that's
right.
one part of it that's reinforced by patriarchy, by this very traditional idea of what it means to be a man. I think the second is to bring forward more, part of that is to bring forward more issues like paternity leave, but are bad for men and women. So that's one of the reasons we want to focus on
Got it.
this, is because there is a power to bringing men and women together to campaign for something that is good for everyone, right? Because it diffuses that idea that men are struggling in society because women are advancing, right? Or that we are a society that favors women over men now. If you can actually point to areas that is where both men and women are suffering,
Yep.
and bring them together to help address it, that helps push back on the idea. I think the second thing is to make sure that we are talking about these issues in a way that, in the kind of language that feels comfortable and recognizable to young men, right? Like you often find that young men and young women might talk about things differently,
Differently, yeah.
or it's interesting that like if you look at the US, there's almost a kind of cultural rebelliousness that's come around Trump, right? He is the way of kicking back against the system and the establishment, or seen to be that.
That's right.
And he's not on political podcasts all the time. He's on kind of semi-political podcasts or like sports podcasts, and he's a cultural figure that appeals to the idea that if you don't like the status quo, you want to give a kicking to those in power. Like Trump's the guy to do it. He's your
Yeah.
guy. And I think
You got to throw out the deep state and the establishment and
yeah,
so on. Yep. It speaks to the
yeah,
sort of
and
rebellion of young men.
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. And I mean, I heard a really interesting argument by a YouTuber called Jimmy the Giant, who talks a lot about this. He used to be on the alt right. He went down a kind of alt right wormhole, and then a year or so ago, kind of brought himself back.
Mm.
And he talks about part of why he went to the right is because that seemed the new rebellious cool thing. But he thinks that he feels like the left is due to become that, right? And I don't think we are that now, but he's optimistic that we can reframe how we talk about our issues to be, again, the kind of what we used to be traditionally, the kind of cool party, right? The party that you
Yeah.
voted for if you wanted to push back against the status quo.
That's right.
And I don't think that's the whole thing here. That's one part of it, but making sure we're getting the language right, we're getting the messengers right, and we're in the right spaces to speak to young men in a way that resonates with them, and we're not on the outside kind of lecturing or hectoring
Right.
or calling them toxic, like pushing people away. We need to find a way to call them back in.
Yeah, I think the anchor being fatherhood, family, children is a very strong one, because it's very hard to sort of negate that, because it's deeply personal. And particularly younger men who are dads, I think they're more likely to relate to this aspect of a new identity, right? I think I was talking to another teacher in my kid's school who's a dad. He was on my show, and he's like, not everything about masculinity is bad. Like chivalry, nobility, and fighting for a cause. These are all very good things about being a man. And it's sometimes they get a bad rap about this whole toxic masculinity as well.
Yeah, I think that's a valuable point. And we try to, for example, talk about in paternity leave, speak to values like dad showing up, stepping up, doing the right thing. You're speaking in those kind of traditional male terms that you're right. That's a positive ideal that a lot of men aspire to, that they can be counted on when it's their moment. They do
Yeah,
their
dependable.
duty. They
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
They look out for their family.
Yep.
They're there when it matters. They'll take the hit. Like that is something that a lot of men resonate with, and it's positive. So we try to lean into things like that in how we talk about paternity leave.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. How again, we also obviously in two different cultures, but there's strong interdependencies. I'm wondering how do you think dads and corporations, organizations, men can amplify this message that you are trying to spread? And I'll take a few lessons from that, and obviously try and do that here through my other dads communities here.
Mm. I'd start with just talking about it,
Yeah.
as basic as that is, like awareness, talking about your experience as a father around the support you did or didn't get, how it was in those early days, how you feel about the role you're able to play in your kids' lives. Like, what part of what we found when we started the campaign is there was a shared narrative that had been built up about mother's experiences after birth and what it meant to not have that support and what it meant to be left carrying the baby literally on your own often. But we didn't have that for dads. We sort of had a lot of isolated men with these experiences that actually had a lot of commonality,
Mm-hmm.
but we hadn't built a narrative of actually this is what it's like
Men's
to be a dad
experience.
after a baby's born. Exactly.
Got it.
And without that kind of shared narrative, it's harder to push awareness, right?
Yep.
So I think that's one thing, is there's a real power in people just talking about it, posting about it online. The second is,
do you have a I saw your website, Alex, but do you have a community, like a social community online or something like that?
we have an Instagram account, which is our primary social media
I see.
account.
Okay.
We're hoping to build some WhatsApp communities
Yeah.
going forward to bring dads together and other parents to meet and talk and build networks, but also to help organize them around the kind of activism we need to take, which is the second part of it. If you're, there are campaigns like ours in other countries, but in lots there aren't, and so it kind of makes it harder to push for coordinated change.
Yep.
But if you can be speaking to your representatives about it, your MPs or whoever it is, I think that's always valuable. And then I think the final thing is looking at the workplace and employers. So it's different in different countries, the extent to which paternity leave is seen as something that should come through the employer versus through the state. In the UK, our argument is very much that it should come through the state. But I know in the US, for example, there's more of a reliance on employers because they don't have any kind of state, federal paternity leave or maternity leave. So there are increasingly, we hear from dads who are campaigning at work to get their employer to improve their paternity leave. Again, we're hoping to provide a bit of training for people, some guides and some resources to help them do that. But I think the more and more you see companies improving their paternity leave offers, the more we're using that as a way of arguing that actually what you're seeing is this two-tier system emerging, right? Big companies offer sometimes 6 months full pay, which is brilliant. If you're a small company, you can't afford that, and so you offer nothing. You offer statutory, and that means that there's huge inequalities.
Right.
And it's a lottery depending on who you work for. And the more, in a way, that gap rises, that gap grows, the stronger the case for government level intervention.
Got it. And so what's your ideal sort of paternity leave amount, if you will?
So yeah, it's a good question. We're at the moment not putting we don't have a specific policy ask. We're trying to land the argument, but it needs to be longer and it needs to be better paid. Those are two crucial things. But if you look at other countries who are doing this really well, Spain is a really interesting case study for us because they, back in 2017, they had 2 weeks just like we did, not much better than ours. They had a bit more pay. And over the last 7 or 8 years, they have gradually phased that up by a year or a week or two every year to the point where now they get 16 weeks at full pay. And what you see is like really good and amazing uptake across everyone, whatever job you do, whether you're working manufacturing or you're a business or science, everyone is using pretty much all of it because it's properly paid. It's had big impacts already on norms around family roles and childcare. And so that's a really interesting one that we're looking at. Another kind of best in class model is Sweden, where both parents get 90 days leave, ring fenced. So you have to use that yourself. You can't give it to your partner. And then they have 300 days on top of that to share between them. And it's all paid at a good level. And what's so good about that is obviously the pay's at a good level. It's a really good amount of time. But it has that ring fence leave, which all the evidence shows you need to have that before you have shared leave if you want dads to actually use it. Otherwise, time and time again, you see in different countries, people just give the leave to mothers because you have to get over the kind of norm of fathers taking that leave first. So it has that ring fence element. And then it's got the flexibility on top of that for parents to choose how to distribute so it works best for them, right? Rather than that having been dictated by their gender, they can choose, this is how we want to share it because that's right for our family. And I think that's where we ultimately want to get to as a society.
Got it. That's a pretty worthy and while it's lofty, but it's worthy vision to pursue for sure.
Yeah, it'll take a while, I think.
Yeah, well, it's always makes a difference to get a start, right? To get started on something.
Of course.
Absolutely. Yeah, I haven't really focused my attention to some of these policies, but yeah, it's through these conversations. I'm definitely getting a lot of encouraging feedback from just other fellow dads and moms about just appreciating the roles of fathers in the family and in the society. So hopefully we'll start to broaden that message to the aspects that you were touching on.
Great.
We'll sort of start to wind down now. What is your mission after, let's say, your goals for DadShift are met?
Good question. Not sure. We're 100% focused on paternity leave at the moment. And
Yeah.
we're a tiny team, sort of one and a half of us, and it's partly volunteer based.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've got limited capacity at the moment. I think we're interested in that point of how can you involve more men and dads in particular in these pro equality
Yeah.
campaigns. And the DadShift obviously focused around parenthood, and there's tons of different stuff in that
Yeah.
area, like childcare, flexible working, access to IVF in this country, for example, is very unequal. So yeah, unsure for now, but lots of other. This is far from the only issue that
Yeah.
needs
I think.
solving when it comes to parenting equality.
Yeah. I think. I mean, it's ironic that we're talking about men, but in a counterintuitive way, as we talked about, it helps women as well. And we are in the middle of starting off the International Women's Day month campaign in our workplaces. And I was seeing a research that I think they are looking at the year 2138 for the world to get to gender equality, which is
Gosh,
another 5 generations of humanity.
wow.
So to your point, I think it's not just about paternity leave, right? There's so many other associated aspects of the roles of men and women, first in the household, in the family, and then you keep broadening it. So it's a lot of work ahead of us.
100%.
Yeah. Well, it was so nice chatting with you, Alex. Appreciate you carving out some time. I'm pretty sure that I'll be following your work, and hopefully we'll be connected. And as you said, even though it's two different cultures, there are sort of these movements are popping up in countries in a sort of a more uncoordinated ways. But I'm hoping that somewhere we stay coordinated and connected, so that we can push this cause together in the world in some shape or form.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant. And if there's anyone in India who listens to this who'd like to chat about starting something similar in India, definitely reach out. We'd love to hear from you.
Great. Well, nice meeting you, and thanks for your time. And we'll be in touch. And have a great rest of your week.
Yeah, my pleasure. You too.